First and foremost, the rule of thumb with this talk is to give shout outs to like the people that you got the talk from. April is kind of like the originator of this whole concept of compassionate code review. So she's like the OG proselytizer. She's kind of like a compassion Nazi, I think is like a good word. Like she's so aggressive with her attempt to deliver this like philosophy that everyone should be compassionate, that she almost like she jams it down your throat, which is like you know, kind of an interesting tactic, and also a good one. And then Brian, some of you may know him. He used to work for In Rhythm. Really a absolute character and model human and In Rhythmer. You know, this picture of him makes him look crazy. It's also his Twitter, you know, profile photo, which says something about his, you know, his fun nature. But Brian was somebody who wrote like literature about empathy and the value of empathy in the workplace, and not just as a software engineer, but in general. You know, and he was the one that gave the compassionate code review talk maybe a year or two ago. You know, that kind of like lit the spark in my mind and kind of motivated me to give this talk. Okay, so Michael touched on something earlier, which was the question of like, what is compassion and how do we define compassion? April defines it as the feeling that arises when you are confronted with another's suffering and you feel motivated to relieve that suffering. You know, being nice sometimes, I think it gets a bad reputation, and it gets associated with weakness. I think on a high level, that can be a kind of a barrier to a lot of people expressing compassion and kindness. You know, to quote Brian, literally, he wrote an article titled "The Importance of Placing Individuals Above Processes and Tools." The first sentence of that article is, "Empathy should be regarded as a superpower." Why? I mean, why do we need empathy? Why is it important? And specifically, why is it important in a code review? I think that's what this talk is aiming to answer. So what is a code review? It's funny how, like, you know, we can, it's probably easier for us as engineers to define what a code review is than to define compassion. I don't know what that says, but smartbear.com says that a code review is, or a peer code review is the act of consciously and systematically convening with one's fellow programmers to check each other's code for mistakes. Like Nick pointed out, which is the whole point of a code review is to catch mistakes. You know, I mean, like, why is this talk, you know, so important? I think to me is because when we talk about a code review, we're talking about someone's work. You know, a work is a reflection of who you are to some degree. I think, you know, when you talk about the author's code in the context of a code review, the author's code is their own work. But with code, sometimes a developer is working in the same files as another developer. You're touching the same work. Maybe somebody else had wrote that file before you, and now you're making a refactor to that page. So it is your work, but it's also their work too. So that you have these interesting dynamics, I think, with code, where it's a mix of work that people feel like they take ownership of. You know, the key thing I want to keep pointing out is that there's these potential for adverse reactions. It's very, very difficult to catch yourself when you're having an adverse reaction. I think it's even more difficult to be aware of the potential for an adverse reaction in someone else. you know, when someone makes changes to someone else's code, there's a potential for adverse reactions there. If someone is overseeing a particular code base and you know, they grow attached to that code base, you know, that attachment alone, it means the potential for an adverse reaction in some form. You know, your work, like I said, is to some degree a reflection of who you are. So in a code review, you know, the author is susceptible to, and the author being the person who engineered the code, the person who wrote the code. I'm going to use the term author as being the person who's engineering the code, and the reviewer is the person who is reviewing the code. The author is susceptible to adversely react to criticism of their own work, and the reviewer, on the other side of things, is susceptible to adversely reacting to new additions to the code base that don't meet the reviewer's standards. This is a slide that I don't have to give any credits for because I made it myself. I'm very proud of it. And this slide sums up kind of, to me, like what the issue is. The issue is actually kind of, it's a subjective issue on the surface. And if you look at this picture, I mean, what it's really saying is that the integrity of the code base is outweighing the integrity of the person writing the code, right? And this is the exact dilemma that we find ourselves in when we talk about adverse reactions, right? When we talk about adverse reactions, we're talking about one person and how they feel about the code, and that the integrity of that code outweighing someone else's personal integrity. Does that make sense? So when someone gives a code review that lacks compassion, you know, they firmly believe they are doing something good by upholding the integrity of the code. They may or may not be doing that, but you know, what we're trying to solve here is the problem that occurs when a reviewer tries to optimize for performance, and then fails to optimize for compassion. So how can we manifest this? I think that's kind of like the crux, right? This is also from April. This is not my own, but it's actually like, this is like actually a really deep sentence right here. Being kind is ultimately more efficient because you avoid triggering someone's defensive threat response. You could actually argue this. I mean, you could argue that maybe triggering defensive threat response isn't always less efficient. But I would argue that on the whole, I think there's a lot of truth to the statement. And I think that its effects are far-reaching, actually. And you know, when we talk about a defensive threat response, what does that mean? When we talk about an adverse reaction, what are we really talking about, right? Sorry, I'm missing. There we go. There we go. So this is actually something that I was particularly, you know, really enticed by. Also, like, looking at an image of the human brain is just like pretty phenomenal. Like, that's actually in your head right now. So, you know, what is a defensive threat response? What is an adverse reaction, right? After the amygdala sends a distress signal, the hypothalamus activates the nervous system by sending signals through the autonomic nerves to the adrenal glands, right? Okay, so adrenal glands, like what does that have to do with? And I mean, that's like not a good thing. Like, where is this going? Like, adrenal glands, like, you're talking fight or flight. You know, that's like a survival response. That's not necessarily something that you want to evoke in a professional atmosphere. What's interesting though is, like, humans are actually more complex than just fight or flight. right? There's a third option, and some of you may have heard of that. I'll touch on that in a second. So okay, so you're having an adverse reaction. Someone writes something in a code review and it pisses you off, or it doesn't, or it makes you crawl into a hole, whatever. Your amygdala is sending a distress signal. Your adrenal glands are firing, right? What are the possible outcomes in this scenario, right? The first one is that, you know, we react, and, you know, fight, flight, no matter which way you slice it, we're reacting, which is a problem because we're not really thinking and meditating on what the response should be. We're just reacting because we're actually reacting from something inside of our brain that is based on adrenaline and is based on you know, this potential just to you know, react based on instinct. It's not necessarily something that's logical or rational, right? So what do? So we you know, we grind our battle axes. You know, we start getting angry, we start getting heated, we start getting flushed. You know, someone says, why don't you call TV to help her here? And you say, no, you're extremely wrong. And you know, you start spamming the keyboard. You know, and this doesn't really get you anywhere. In fact, it creates another adverse reaction in the other person, and it sets you backwards. So, you know, what's another option? Okay, flight. You know, I smash my keyboard, go to a desert island. Okay, well, that's not an option. You know, and kind of the long-term outcome of flight is finding a new job, which, you know, is not good. Either way you slice it, it's just not good. You know, and there's this third thing called freeze, right? So there's fight, flight, or freeze. There's actually another fourth one called fawn, which I'm not going to get into, but if you want to read about that, you could. Freeze is an interesting one because if you really analyze how people act in most situations, and especially in the context of a code review, it's actually freezing, right? When you freeze, like, it's under the circumstances where neither fight or flight is viable. So freezing up or numbing out, disassociating from the here and now. You know, the here and now in this sense, what are we talking about? I mean, there's a lot of different contexts to that. Disassociating is the key word here, though, I think. And there's instances where you don't want to argue, but you also don't want to quit your job, and you become apathetic. Apathy is scary on a lot of levels, because if you're apathetic to receiving critical feedback, and you have no problem, you know, making suggested changes, like, that's ideal. That's like kind of ideal apathy. But apathy can easily kind of stray and get ugly. Like, if you're so apathetic that you don't push back against criticism when that criticism isn't adding any value, then you're hurting yourself by freezing up. And if you become so apathetic that you no longer feel invested in the code base, that's the epitome of like negative freezing. So what strategies can we employ to help us prevent triggering adrenal responses in our code reviews? This is kind of the whole point of this talk. You know, we want to avoid all of these scenarios. We don't want to trigger adrenal glands. So this is essentially something April borrowed from Buddha, actually. Some of you might recognize this. Thich Nhat Hanh has wrote extensively on this. This is insanely difficult to practice on a word-by-word basis in your daily life. However, I would argue that because you have to type out a response in a code review, it's actually necessary to allow yourself to let what you're typing out pass through these three gates before you hit the submit button. I think it's easier to do that in a code review than it is like in an active conversation. You know, because in an active conversation, it's by word, so you get that kind of level of separation with a code review. Is it true? Is it necessary? And is it kind? Something might be true to say in a code review. It might be necessary. Maybe there's a better way to say it. Maybe you know, you're not saying it with kindness. Maybe there's a better way to say it. And how do you say it with kindness? right? Is it true? If it's your opinion, say it's your opinion. If it's a fact, consider sharing a source. Matt actually joined this call. Matt recently did that in a code review comment. He left like a Stack Overflow, reference to what he was talking about in his comment. Try a question instead. I mean, that's something that we learned from Life Labs. This is literally what we all learned at Life Labs, asking questions. Avoid shoulding on people, which I think is funny because, yeah, just you shouldn't should on people. Is it necessary, right? The best part about this is nitpicks. Now, like, we literally have a precedent in code reviews where you write nit before you write something that's a nitpick, and it signals emotionally, it communicates that you feel like this isn't a major thing, but you also feel like it's worth mentioning. And then from the actual author's perspective, they see that nit prefix in the code review comment, and it signals something to them that, like, oh, he understands or she understands that this comment might not be the most important thing. And that's all I needed to, like, that little bit of empathy is like really all I needed to go and happily do that nitpick comment. So, like, but when we talk about being careful with nitpicks, like, what does that mean? And how do you exercise being careful with nitpicks? I mean, necessary, the word necessary by itself is so subjective. Like what is necessary to one person might not be necessary to somebody else. So when you talk about nitpicks, like, nitpicks are fine, but like, how do we be careful with nitpicks? One way that I think we can be careful with nitpicks is if we find ourselves in the position where, there's like only one comment that we have and it's a nitpick that like doesn't really affect performance really. And it would slow down like the overall kind of flow of the development experience for the team. Then maybe it's not necessary. So, how do you deem that? I think that's something that's very difficult. But also checking your motives kind of inherently answers that for you, doesn't it? Because like sometimes if you're being honest with yourself, like your motives might not be pure, and even for saying something that like in a response to something that someone else said, like your motives for that might not be pure. So this is like a good gateway to allow your dialogue to pass through before you actually hit that send button. And finally, like, is it kind? Avoid insults and shaming. That goes without saying. Remember, you're dealing with a human. Assume competence. I mean, that's something that I saw someone recently. We had a meeting with this guy, Fahim, and he did a really good job of assuming competence. And we would tell him like, hey, we need to do this. And he would say, well, you need to do this. And we say, well, we need some help with that. And he'd say, that's totally okay. I understand how you need help with that. Like assume someone's competence and be like, why do you need help with that? Like why do you need help? Like that assuming competence is actually a huge sign of empathy and respect. It goes a long way. And kind of finally offer gratitude. That's a big one. Choosing the right medium. Also, there's some things that, like, I think what they mean by medium is there's some things that are better left maybe in a direct message or an email. So sometimes there's a certain medium. Maybe in a group chat isn't the best thing. Maybe direct messaging somebody about it is a better way to go about it. So choosing the right medium is really important too. General rule of thumb, words to avoid in code reviews, right? Just. I know this is like everyone's favorite word in a lot of different ways, because like just could mean like you could say, oh, all you gotta do is just change this. And it's like, no, like just is like a keyword for meaning a lot more work, scope increase, right? But also it's not the type of word that you want to use in a code review. It's usually like a signal that the whatever you're trying to say is lacking compassion, right? And then obviously, like if someone's saying obviously in a code review comment, then it's obviously a code review lacking compassion. So you know, kind of like the final bit before we dive into some examples is this whole concept of responding instead of reacting, right? Because when we react, we're triggering our adrenal glands and we're not getting the best response. When we respond, take a breath, close our eyes, take a moment to think about what exactly it is we're trying to say, and then determine how we want to say it. And then that's an adequate response. That's kind of like the goal here. That's what we're striving for. So here's some examples, right? This is like a perfect example. I mean, this is like textbook. Like, why didn't you just do this, right? You know, the word just, obviously, like, it jumps off. There's a better way to say this, right? Notice how the unhelpful way frames the situation such that only one way exists. There's just the reviewer's way, right? But the helpful way acknowledges that the engineering author, they also have a way, and you know, another way exists, and this other way that the reviewer is suggesting has these benefits that outweigh the original implementation. I think you'll find that that's a theme. You know, notice the first one had X. Why didn't you just do X? Well, you can also do X, but then there's also this added benefit part. I mean, when you're talking about benefits, especially with code, you're talking about objective benefits. Like, usually, like, these are objective benefits. So these are things that can be expressed in a way where it's like, hey, I'm not attacking you personally. I'm saying you had a way of doing this. I'm acknowledging your way, and now I'm going to acknowledge this other way that I personally think is better, and here's why I think it's better, right? That second way does so many things. I mean, it acknowledges that the first way existed. You're talking about someone's work. Like, how is someone supposed to feel if they feel like their work is not being acknowledged at all? You know, so we have to think about like literally how we're shaping these questions and the type of questions that we ask. It has these potentials for these adverse reactions, which we're trying to avoid. Okay. Okay, so this one's great. The unhelpful. Pull all these translations into a constants file. Straight up, easy. You know, I'll go do that. But this could also be said in a different way, right? It could be phrased as a question. What would you think about pulling these translations into a constants file? There are a lot, and a separate file might make sense, right? It's like almost like a collaborative effort. This is literally life labs. I mean, like, this is the stuff that I think we learned in life labs. You know, the unhelpful way, it sounds like a fascist dictatorship. You know, life labs, they taught us that we should ask questions to incentivize, because people feel more motivated to do something if they feel like it's their own idea. This can also come from a group's confluence of ideas, which is essentially what this helpful phrase does. You know, it acknowledges that the author exists, and they might have thoughts about something, and this is a particularly difficult thing to do in practice. It's something that like I'm working on myself. You know, it's literally not easy to do this. Okay, we'll do one more of these. This one's like egregiously bad. Like, I don't think anyone like really talks like that. Maybe they do. Like, I've never had anybody that was like that rude. But like, I think the key takeaway from this slide, like if we don't try to like, you know, jump on the wording too much, is that the unhelpful reviewer, they don't allude to testing the code themselves, although they may or may not have. But the way it's phrased when the helpful reviewer says it, like they clearly address the fact that they tested the code, you know, because they tested it and they have the edge cases. So again, you're bundling in objectivity with something, and just by doing that, you're taking kind of the emotions out of it. You know, the objectivity is really our friend here, right? So I wanted to bring this up again, like code review, because like really the whole goal of a code review is to catch mistakes. That's like the key here, right? Also, this slide is great, and I feel like it kind of highlights the issue here. The issue from the perspective of someone who's having an adverse reaction. This could be the person doing the review or the author who's having their code reviewed. What they're doing, what essentially is they're putting the the integrity of the code over the other person's personal integrity, which is what we're trying to avoid here, right? Because really what this is about things that are objective and things that are subjective, right? The subjective Says I love oranges, and the objective, they talk about what's there. If we try to see the light in what someone who is leaving a code review that lacks compassion, if we try to say like, what is it about what they're seeing that has merit? This is it right here. So in other words, like if we go back, this is the problem, but this is also kind of like our way out. Is like that objectivity is our way out. This isn't a personal attack on anybody. It's just a clear outlining that, hey, there's X, Y, and Z benefits to this implementation versus this other implementation that you have, right? And I think, I put this slide in because I think there's a lot to be said about how you practice compassion when you're in a traffic jam. And then there's also parallels there that I can draw to a code review, right? For example, if you are stuck in traffic, you have somewhere to go. If you're having your code review, that means you probably have a ticket that you're working on. And if you're a part of some sort of agile team, that means you're trying to move your tickets over. You're trying to close out your tickets before your sprint. So that's your place to go, right? The code reviewer leaving these comments is the traffic jam, right? Now, when you're in a traffic jam in real life, and I've done this before, you could literally have the thought like, wow, like I'm in traffic right now. This sucks. I'm angry. Or you could sit there and be like, wow, I'm in traffic right now. I wonder what happened up there. I wonder if someone got into an accident. I hope someone's okay. Two completely different, trains of thought. You're not thinking about yourself anymore in the second one. And that's essentially the same thing that you need to do when you find yourself in this situation in a code review, is you need to realize that there's somebody else up ahead and they have an opinion and they have something that needs to be expressed. And whether or not they're expressing that with compassion or not doesn't actually take away from the objective things that they're saying, if they're saying any objective things at all, right? Okay, so I want to wrap it up. I know we're kind of pushing time, right? I want to lead with some compassionate directives, right? Compassionate directives to avoid triggering adrenal responses in people. This is kind of basic stuff, but it's actually I actually feel like there's value in this, right? Acknowledging the other's perspective in a positive way. When we talk about code, that was the first example. Hey, your way of doing things works, but there's this other way. That's essentially acknowledging the other person's perspective, right? Consider the other's opinion on suggested changes, right? So now when you're collaborating back and forth, if someone else throws something, acknowledge that that person said something and they offered that, and consider it. That's showing that's an expression of compassion just by considering someone else's opinion. It's so trivial, right? Outlining objective facts. This is the one that I really tried to drive home in this talk, and this is what you have to fall back on. Is there's a recipe for compassion, and it has to do with acknowledging the other person and sticking to the facts. Who knew? Optimizing for performance and then for compassion, right? Because a lot of the time when we're looking at code, we're saying, what's the most performant way to do this? What's the time complexity? How can I optimize this? How many re-renders is this triggering? Can I reduce the number of re-renders? But is there a better way, right? That's performance. But once we optimize for performance, how do we deliver that optimization with compassion? How do we optimize for compassion in order to deliver that? So I really hope that you walk away from this with with at least something to help your code reviews be more compassionate, and may you not trigger adrenal responses in anybody.